Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started with our last panel, titled Homeland Defense and Force Projection. As we've talked about today, I mean, one of our Army's in the past competitive advantage has been we play the away game. I think that we've seen through the discussions in the panels today that is probably no longer the case. Again, whether that's cyber or kinetic attacks in the homeland. So I think this is a very apropos panel to wrap up our day on Homeland Defense and Force Projection. We're very happy today to have as our moderator, Mr. Sherman Patrick, the Vice President of Strategy at Norwich University Applied Research Institutes. Mr. Patrick has got a bachelor's in government from the College of William and Mary, a master's in national security and strategic decision-making from the U.S. Naval War College. And prior to his current position as the VP of Strategy at Norwich, he spent 16 years in the United States Senate, specializing in national security and the cyber domain policy, veterans policy, among other issue areas. He started with then Senator Joe Biden on the Foreign Relations Committee, and he culminated in serving Senator Patrick Leahy as legislative director. So, Mr. Patrick, over to you.
Thanks, Jack. Good afternoon. We have last panel of the day, mid-afternoon rules here. I'm going to give some brief introductions, and then each of us are going to spend a few minutes talking about our issue area and turn it over to you for questions. And we will move through all the interesting topics here on an area that I'm glad to be finishing on here, Homeland Defense Force Projection. In a contested logistics environment, it's one in which the Homeland Defense functions, they need to be looked at in a renewed fashion. Norwich University's former chairman, General Gordon Sullivan, he took this very seriously himself. And he would always describe how it was important, and when you really look in three different ways, and our panel represents these ways well. We need to think about how to get things from the homeland. We need to think about how to get things throughout the homeland here. And we also need to think about how we're thinking about doing it. It's a very simplistic version. General Sullivan could have given you a better version. But to some things that have changed are not only our last panel talked about the cyber, talked about how the cyber domain shortens distances. We've seen that our threats are more able to reach out to us than before, but we also have threats from the climate itself. Weather, since the beginning of time, has been an issue for armies wherever they went. But with climate change, we've been seeing a need to refocus how we address logistics and to think about what it is that logistics has to account for in daily functions. General Sullivan has helped establish at Norwich University the Center for Global Resiliency and Security, or GRS. And since it is mid-afternoon, I'll pause just a second to let you contemplate those initials. And at Norwich, we've been spending a lot of time with these questions, and I will ask each of our panelists today how it plays into the way they think about their jobs. So the panelists today, we're going to lead off with Major General Gavin Lawrence. He's the commanding general at Military Surface Deployment and Distribution. He's a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy, and he has 2 master's degrees from the Navy War College and the Army War College. So well done on going joint, sir. Among his large amount of relevant experience, he's been the Deputy Chief of Staff and Director of Logistics at U.S. Army Forces Command. He's been the commander of the Defense Logistics Agency Troop Support in Philadelphia, and has most recently been the Deputy Chief of Staff G4 for U.S. Army Forces Command. Our second panelist is going to be Major General Scott Sherman, currently the Deputy Commanding General, Support National Guard, and Commander of Task Force 51, U.S. Army North, the 5th Army. He has 2 master's degrees as well, one from the Army War College and one from Colorado State University. After graduating from West Point, General Sherman was in the active duty field artillery, and then joined the Colorado National Guard, where he served among his many roles as Director of Joint Staff, Joint Forces Headquarters, Colorado. This is the command in Colorado that is important for leading the National Guard's response to domestic events as well. And our final panelist will be Mr. Andrew Metrick, a fellow at the Defense Program for the Center for New American Security. He has done a great deal of research focusing on linkages between strategic objectives and operational plans, with a specific interest in understanding the implications of protracted global conflict against peer states. Mr. Metrick has a BA from George Washington University and unfortunately only has one master's degree, but it's from Georgetown. So well done. We're going to turn right to the panelists now, and then we're going to get to your questions. Thank you. General Lawrence, please lead us off.
Hey, thanks, Sherman. Let me start off by thanking General Brown, General Haley, and the entire AUSA leadership for hosting today's hot topic. And as we conducted, I think, some phenomenal focus discussions on contested logistics. I know there may be some of you that when we got the agenda for today, they looked at the last panel discussion, in their mind, there was questions about, hey, why are we having a panel that is talking about Homeland defense and force projection? Because to the lay person, they may seem like two diametrically opposed topics. But hopefully from the conversations we've had today, you can see the connection in terms of the importance of defending the homeland, defending our transportation networks, and our ability to project combat power where and when needed in support of national objectives. You heard General Formica mentioned earlier, we are a global army, we're a global DoD. But if you look at our force posture, the reality is that we are a CONUS-based force. 85% of the joint force is positioned here on the continental United States, right? And so when you look at requirements that our Army, our DoD will have to execute, it's lynched upon our ability to project combat power from the continental United States to OCONUS locations elsewhere to meet national security interests. And I absolutely believe that our ability to project combat power is a competitive advantage that we currently maintain. Just look at what we're doing globally, supporting operations in Ukraine, sending RAF forces to Europe to assure our allies that are part of NATO. In the wake of the events on October 7th, supporting Israel, increasing our force posture in the CENTCOM area of operations. And we're all doing that simultaneously while we continue to campaign in the Indo-Pacific against our pacing threat. Yeah, our ability to project combat power absolutely is a competitive advantage. But when we talk about contested operations, I think someone said earlier, contested with a big C, large-scale combat operations against a peer adversary, we absolutely have got to make sure that we have the ability to defend our transportation nodes and their associated networks to project combat power. And so therein, in my opinion, from my standpoint point, you talked about this earlier, Sherman, there's a link. In addition, again, from my vantage point, as part of the Joint Deployment and Distribution Enterprise, providing global transportation support, we can't look at our requirements to support the global combatant command requirements in isolation and associated transportation requirements required for that. Again, as we look at LISCO, large-scale combat operations, again, against a peer adversary, and I think Scott will talk to this during his piece, there is going to be a requirement to defend critical domestic nodes, right? And so we can't look at the outflow of combat power in isolation, because competing for conveyances will be domestic requirements to get them to critical nodes. And so it's very important that we understand holistically our requirements in terms of force protection, right? And also the requirements in terms of defense of our homeland and critical assets. I look forward to the conversation and the questions we'll have as part of this panel. Thanks, Sherman.
Thank you, General. General Sherman.
All right. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. A real pleasure to be here. Critical support and ideas that AUSA brings forward and bringing awareness to the strategic challenges that we're going to face in the future. It's great, and it's been great discussion here today. I'm going to briefly highlight Army North's role in supporting power projection and what contested deployments mean in our ability to project power in the homeland and in support of other commands. So for Army North, Homeland Defense is our #1 priority. It's what we look at every day. So one of the most critical tasks that we look at for Homeland Defense is assuring power projection for military capabilities and mitigating the effects of attacks against the homeland. Defense of critical infrastructure is essential. It's essential that we do it. And it's the only way we're going to have success in power projection and demonstrating national resilience. As we're discussing it today, our competitors are actively competing and contesting us in the non-kinetic domain. But we also have to look at the kinetic domain if, God forbid, that ever were to happen. And we got to make sure that we protect against critical defense, government, and civilian infrastructure to make sure that we can respond effectively. One of DoD's biggest concerns is protecting our critical infrastructure and port-to-port lines of communication. That allows the services to get the fight overseas and to operate from the homeland. Power projection from the homeland in a contested environment is an extremely complex problem set that requires unity effort across our whole of government. And they were talking about earlier, it's also the industry level too, not only federal, state, local level, and the tribal, but it's also going to take our work with the industry level. So power projection also relies on public and privately owned critical infrastructure at installations, transportation networks, and air and sea ports of embarkation, most of which, they're digitally connected. And as we've seen, they're very vulnerable. So a unique set within the homeland is that the Army and DoD must be prepared to defend critical infrastructure in all domains. What we're looking at is some of the biggest areas, integrated air missile defense, when we're protecting critical infrastructure. We must have the capabilities to rapidly detect, track, and respond to threats, including coordination with civilian agencies and executing C2 and joint kill chain in areas of the homeland that routinely have heavy civilian air traffic. We've shown just recently that we sometimes have difficulty with that. Interagency coordination from the tactical to the operational level to identify roles and responsibilities. This is another area that we work heavily with FEMA and all of our state and interagency partners on, especially with defense support of civil authorities. But when it comes to Homeland Defense, we still have a long way to go. Big things that we got to look at in that realm is our common operational picture, our communication, our systems accesses, but also the classification challenges that we have. And not only is it our classification of some of our data, but also in the intelligence oversight arena, we also have to, there's also, especially on the federal law enforcement side, there's certain areas under current Title 10 that they cannot share with us. So to prepare for this future fight, Army North's Future of Homeland Defense project, which is nested with Northcom's Homeland Defense Design Next initiative, is examining the impact of emerging technologies on Homeland Defense and assessing how the Army must prepare Homeland Defense operations in the 2040 operational environment. The Future of Homeland Defense is being supported by the Deputy Undersecretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff of the Army. And through monthly design workshops, we've had 4 in 2023, and we have 9 here in 2024. It's incorporating inputs from U.S. Army North staff, all the Army commands, as well as other service components joint partners and subject matter experts, both from the civilian sector and private industry and academia. And we're looking at effects that we can use technology to achieve, that we want to achieve in the 2040 and beyond Homeland Defense. Our monthly design workshops are covering AI, cyber, quantum physics, social media, behavioral science, robotics, nanotechnology, directed energy, hypersonics, and bioenergy. It's everything that we're talking about today, a lot of these things. So the workshop outputs will provide really critical inputs to Army Futures Command Future Studies Program, and will generate scenarios, injects, and other considerations to feed exercises. In 2026 and beyond, through the POM, we're now going to have the Homeland Defender exercise. We're going to start at looking at defense critical infrastructure and really working that exercise in the homeland, and also with the European and Pacific Defender exercises, trying to have this scenario also include homeland defense and force protection that we're going to have to do. So the workshops, those will culminate in a final report in FY24 here at the end. And that, like I said, that'll go in the Army Futures Command Future Studies Program. So again, thanks. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, General. Mr. Metrick.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. Let me set my timer so I don't ramble for too long, which will happen inevitably since I work at a think tank. Thanks so much for inviting me, and to AUSA for inviting me. This is a fantastic topic. Despite having long hair and a beard, I have been around long enough where I can remember when no one wanted to talk about logistics, and it was sort of the redheaded stepchild of defense analysis. And it's good that it's being brought front and center by a forum like this, because it's always crucial to military power. But when we think about large combat operations, the criticality of it is only made more evident. So by this point, I think we should all recognize that the homeland is not a sanctuary. My voice is but one in a chorus that is saying this. But it's important to recognize, as Major General Lawrence points out, that the homeland is a key weapon system. It's a key element in projecting U.S. combat power. And the ability of the United States to project combat power around the globe on short notice is our key differentiator when you compare us with our adversaries. Neither China nor Russia, nor any of the lesser included threats, have the same ability of the United States to put real meaningful combat power on the other side of the globe in 48 hours. That is a key differentiator for the United States and something that we should lose sight of at our peril. But the homeland is not a sanctuary. That's something we all know. From kinetic threats to non-kinetic threats, the threats are real. You can pick up your phone. You can read about ongoing cyber attacks against United States critical infrastructure. You can pull up NASIC's unclassified DIBSMAC report that looks at ballistic missile threats. You can read stories in the news. You see it every day all around you. It is both in peacetime and in wartime. It is a constant thing that we have to inculcate into our daily lives, our daily patterns of thought, and as Major General Sherman pointed out, into the way that we train, we think about the future operating environment. I want to add one other domain that probably hasn't come up today, which is the cognitive domain, information warfare and information operations. An important part of adversary targeting strategies, especially when thinking about PRC and systems destruction warfare, is that cognitive domain. It's how are they using the robustness of American society against us? How are they using our open system, our freedom of press, our freedom of speech against us? That is an important thing to think about, because that's a way, it's another arrow in their quiver of slowing down our ability to force generate from the homeland. I know I've been talking about how the homeland is not a sanctuary, but I want to put in one asterisk to that might cause some people to change their minds on one particular part of this. The homeland is not a sanctuary until it is. One of the disquieting things about thinking about protracted war is when we talk about precision weapons and precision strike over global ranges, there's a relatively small number of those systems that exist. You know, even if they might be in thousands, that is still a finite number. At some point in the conflict, you enter this odd state that is the sanctuary of mutual exhaustion, at which point both sides do not have the ability to bring each other's sanctuary under threat, or have a more limited ability to do so. That's just an interesting thing to think about when we step beyond 14 days into conflict, when we step beyond 60 days, when we look out into that disquieting future of a deep, protracted conflict against a peer. The homeland might be more of a sanctuary than we think it is. I think one of the other important things is, how do we maintain scale? How do we achieve scale in that deep fight? And part of that, which Major General Sherman sort of alluded to, is protecting industry. When you think about what you need to protect from a homeland perspective, getting from fort to port is crucial. But where are the key industrial nodes that also need to be protected? And it's not just about moving the often integrated air missile defense capabilities to those sites. As we've seen in Ukraine, it's about sustaining the firepower of those to eat potential large numbers of raids. Again, that is something that I don't necessarily think we've gotten our head fully way around, but is a piece there. I gave Sherman a heads up that I might say this in response to questions, but it's the afternoon, so here goes. There's a disquieting thing here. What is the homeland? Is it CONUS? Is it OCONUS? What role do U.S. overseas territories play in homeland defense? Guam is one of them, but there are other lesser known U.S. overseas territories that, especially in the Pacific, are interesting and are problematic. And the uncomfortable truth here is that there are other things that aren't sort of brought up that really point to issues where they're in the seams, or the things that we used to be good at that we are no longer good at today. Or maybe we have less capacity for it today. So one of which is, who owns counter space in CONUS? When we think about denying adversary kill chains against CONUS-based targets, a key part of that is space. Who owns that mission? Who should own that mission? How does that mission bifurcate across or be split out across echelons? When you're in transport, who is potentially denying that kill chain? And the truly uncomfortable one, and this is an area of my current research, is it is appearing as if there's a potential, and we've seen this in the way that the Russians have attempted to nuclear saber rattle, there is a growing specter of non-strategic nuclear weapons use. And it's not just in a Korean Peninsula scenario. It's potentially in others. And in that way, how are we positioned, trained, and postured to think about fighting around and through effects from weapons of mass destruction? This has come up at different points in time in different places, but it's something that is one of those scary things out in the tall grass that I think we should start to pay a little bit more attention to. And with that, very excited to take all your questions. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm excited to see them for you. We have our last panel discussed the issue of commercial partners when it came to technology and it came to spectrum. Commercial technology and commercial partners are extremely important as well when we talk about logistics throughout the homeland and from the homeland. And we have a number of questions about them. I'm going to read one of them that I think is symbolic of them, and it's Major Lawrence, if you don't mind answering first, and then General Sherman. Sorry, Major Lawrence. General Lawrence. It's been a few years, I know. General Lawrence, answer this first, and then General Sherman, if you don't mind chiming in your thoughts. Do you think that our current agreements with commercial carriers, air and sea, are sufficient to augment and support the required forces that we will need to deploy?
I will. So let me start off by saying that our agreements with our commercial carriers are absolutely vital to our ability to project combat power. A lot of people are surprised when I tell them, as the SCDC commanding general, I don't own any sea lift. I don't own any line haul trucks. I don't own any rail, right? And I certainly don't own the majority of the seaports that we operate out of as the DoD single port manager. Everything that we do as part of the joint deployment and distribution enterprise, particularly from a surface transportation standpoint, is by, through, and with our commercial partners who, Transcom, James knows this from having served that command, we affectionately call the fourth component because of what they do in terms of providing effects. Ensuring there is enough commercial transportation capacity is one of the major points of emphasis that we focus on SDDC as part of U.S. Transcom. As the SDDC-CG, I work as the chair of the Executive Surface Working Group, where we meet with commercial transportation industry on a quarterly basis to have discussions on where they stand in terms of their posture, their readiness, what are the things that they are dealing with that are impacting them. So as we have engagements with them, legislative leadership or DoD leadership as appropriately, we can actively provide a synopsis of where they stand and where they're partnering. And then we also have working agreements with commercial industry, CLIF through the voluntary inter-CLIF agreement, right? Where we have commercial capacity that we're getting from industry, and we have a ready reserve force from commercial industry to provide us surface transportation support. The CRAFT program for our airlift to provide us commercial air capability. So there's a number of mechanisms that we have through U.S. Transcom. We execute through our USC 09, soon to be USC 10 contracts to ensure where and when needed, commercial industry is postured to answer the call.
Thank you. General Sherman, I know that you also have some experience with disaster response and needs related there. Can you share not only your thoughts on this, but how Army North looks at the commercial transportation within the United States for response?
Sure. We kind of look, so to really start, what Army North is focusing on is first, what forces are going to be available at that time that we can use in the homeland, and what with those forces, what we're going to do in order to help Transcom, SDDC, everyone to get those supplies, to get that equipment moved, and what coordination needs to be take place at the national level, whether that is making it interstate solely for military equipment use, and what kind of coordination that has to happen. When we look at domestic response, until just a few years ago, when CISA started taking a really hard look at this, we had a huge disconnect between what states and territories thought and the governors thought what critical infrastructure was and what the federal government thought was critical infrastructure. And that's what FEMA and CISA have been working really hard to do, to make sure that, for lack of a better word, the governors and their state governments understand what critical infrastructure that we can tell them, at an unclassified level, at a certain classification, what is in their particular state or territory and what they have to be looking at too. I come from the state of Colorado, and there was a huge disconnect between the state of Colorado and what the federal government thought was critical infrastructure. So that's another part that we're working on. And I think with CISA coming on board, and we've realized we've brought that up, we're getting there with the states on what is critical infrastructure, not only from the federal side, but also learning from the state side, because the state looks at the industrial base too, and what's critical in that particular area. And it's critical that we have a plan, and it's almost overwhelming how large it is. And then with our current forces that we have, what's going to be available here in the homeland to do that?
Thank you. Andrew, critical infrastructure has come up a couple of times here. We have a number of questions about it. You also mentioned the cognitive domain as something else we should be thinking about. At Nuwari, we do so much work with cybersecurity, and we know we do a lot of critical infrastructure exercising, and we have distributed tabletop exercises, and many of our scenarios involve actual attacks through the cognitive domain to have effect on critical infrastructure. Can you just talk a little bit about what critical infrastructure, how we might think about critical infrastructure, how we might think about the threats to it?
Thanks. So let me try to answer this in a few parts. I think critical infrastructure is one of those things that is incredibly pernicious to define because it is so broad. And if you open your aperture enough, it can cease to be a useful description because you put everything in it. So I think that leads one to say, what are the things that are most critical? And where can I start to accept accept risk and accept that things might not work. So in that space, you're probably thinking about things that are like absolutely necessary for the continuing functioning of society as true critical infrastructure. But those are probably the things that are outside of the immediate military realm, but are vital to maintain from a cognitive perspective. Why? Because if people all of a sudden's lives, the average American's lives is incredibly disrupted, it can generate effects that are targeting the American body politic and therefore will to fight. And I don't think that the United States has experienced what that means in a very long time. And I think our adversaries look at that and say, that is a potential vulnerability. That is a potential point of weakness. And that is something that they're willing to go after. So I didn't exactly answer your question, but I think that's a way to frame it and a way to focus on why it's so important.
So the only thing I would add to what Andrew said is that it takes a whole of government approach with regard to this. Certainly from a Department of Defense standpoint, we have a codified list of locations from a DoD perspective that we have identified as critical infrastructure based upon DoD requirements. When you think about transportation networks, we have our national defense programs, the highways for national defense program, the railway for national defense program, the ports for national defense program that works through U.S. Transcom and our Joint Distribution Analysis Center, or JDPAC Center, that is working with local, state, and federal government to ensure that our transportation networks are meeting DoD requirements, to ensure they're being upgraded and maintained as we modernize our force and the associated requirements with regard to that. But to Andrew's point, I think that's just a DoD perspective, right? And so, we're in regular collaboration with the Department of Transportation, Department of Homeland Security, to ensure we have a common sight picture on requirements, where we're postured, and what we're doing to secure those critical nodes.
Thank you. And General Sherman, when you talk about common operating pictures and shared decision making with these critical infrastructure operators and all the other people that might be involved, as General Lawrence says, we have a DoD perspective here that we can look at. But how do you get the buy-in to get people to participate and appreciate and practice responding?
So, we already do it now with really our defense support of civil authorities, with our defense coordinating elements and our DCOs at each FEMA region. We do an annual certification exercise for those FEMA regions, where we have an exercise where we have them coordinate, where not only are we coordinating on the federal side, but we also have a state coordinating official, tribal, if there's tribes in that area, and then industry representatives too, especially for critical ones that are in that area that FEMA really brings to the table that we're working on. That's where we work to get a common operational picture, and we work on that. Now, Andrew brought up a good point that probably we haven't stressed enough. We're doing it right now in FEMA Region 1 up in the Northeast. We're actually having a CBRN event there, a mass casualty event there, where they're having them test that in the region. But one thing that we've discussed too, when you're talking with a society that only has 2 days of food in the grocery store, that our electrical grid, all the major components of that are produced overseas. And if they're damaged, taking months, and in case of a contested environment, could take close to a year to get those online. How do we deal with that? So that's something we're taking a hard look too. We're taking a look at the defense critical infrastructure. How can we look at developing multi-domain resiliency zones, setting that up in the area, not only for that DCI, that defense critical infrastructure, but the surrounding community, that we can use their civilian infrastructure too, and to make it resilient with all kinds of capabilities. And then also setting up multi-domain protection so that if that particular DCI was attacked, that we could use those assets to protect it on any domain.
Thank you. In my my last budget cycle on the Hill, one particular critical infrastructure focus that kept coming up from members of Congress was related to seaports in particular. And there was a great interest, and there has since been a great deal of funding directed towards both expanding and improving the seaports that are currently used, but also pursuing seaport diversification. General Lawrence, can you talk a little bit about how you think about seaports and moving things?
Yes, I'll start off by talking about, from my perspective, the importance of strategic sea lift in support of force projection. I alluded to earlier, 85% of our joint force is positioned, stationed in the continental United States at our post-Camden installations. And of that 85%, when you look at the requirements to move critical cargo and equipment associated with those units, 90% of that will move by strategic sea lift. And so when we talk about large-scale combat operations against a peer adversary, heavy lifting will be done by strategic sea lift and our ability to move critical cargo, combat equipment by and through our commercial ports. One of the initiatives that Transcom, by proxy, STDC is pushing is port diversification. And really what that entails is the deliberate attempt to expand the portfolio of seaports that we are utilizing in support of program deployments. Getting units out of their comfort zone that have a habitual relationship from a seaport of embarkation, debarkation, and having them use a commercial strategic seaport or alternate seaport that may not be in exact geographical proximity to that unit. One, from a U.S. Transcom standpoint, it's enabling us to confirm the capacity of those seaports to meet DoD requirements, establishing relationships with the port authorities and the connective tissue with those elements so that when it comes to times of crisis, you're not starting relationships, you're not building relationships. The relationships already exist. And then there's intangible benefits to port diversification in terms of its ability to, by habitual use, generate investment in those ports. We've seen that in the Gulf ports, where we've executed a number of them, and we've seen about $39 million in investments over the past year at the federal and state level to ensure upkeep and maintenance of that infrastructure. And then the training the units get themselves from, dealing with the physics problem of moving from that post-camp or installation down to a port and loading vessels for onward movement.
And then diversification, I believe, also helps with the resiliency piece as well, to make sure.
Absolutely. Resiliency in terms of providing alternate courses of action, should we be contested in an environment, demonstrating to our allies the ability to project combat power from different ports, hopefully deterring our adversaries who are watching us, and as we project combat power, and ultimately causing the last D dilemmas, right? Dilemmas because they don't know from where and when we'll be able to project combat power.
Thank you. General Sherman, one thing I do remember from the port funding events was there were a huge number of stakeholders there, both within the community and the private industry, but also within DoD itself. Can you just talk in general about DoD stakeholder impacts on logistics operations and when conflicting interests and priorities might affect those?
Well, I think we even have conflicting interests within DoD, whether it be Transcom, whether it be combatant commands, whether it be internally to the U.S., that we're going to really have to make sure that we have a joint plan. I mean, that's really the critical thing. Yeah, I think for the ports is really a big part of that. And like Gavin mentioned, it's going to take a whole of government approach. It's really critical, as Transcom does, is making sure that we're really linked in tight with DHS and with the Department of Transportation on all this. It's critical. And it's critical that, from Army North perspective, it's immediately getting liaisons at those elements on the ground where we can help that at the state and local level, so that we're making sure we're supporting, Gavin, SDDC, and Transcom when they have to move those forces. And it's really the people, he talked about setting those up. That's what we really tasked the defense coordinating officers, the colonels that we have at each FEMA region. It's their job to know everybody. And we make sure that they know everybody, and they're not handing out business cards when the event happens. They know who to call, so we can immediately start coordination.
Andrew, I couldn't agree more with what General Sherman just said, and when other panels have used this phrase, whole of government, whole of society, and it's a fantastic concept, and it's absolutely the right answer. But when I started working on Capitol Hill, working in security 20 years ago, everyone was using the same words. And I'm sure when General Sullivan was starting off in the Army, people were talking about that sort of collaboration. What is so hard about whole of government, whole of society that we're still talking about it?
So I think whole of government is like one of those like bingo words that if you ever read a strategy document, it will be in there. Nexus is probably another one that like everyone will be also in every single think tank report. So I live in a glass house. I think whole of government is one of those things we always hope to achieve, and if we get half the way there, we're probably doing a good job. I think it's so hard to achieve because ultimately, to Major General Sherman's point, it's about knowing people, and it's about connections that are ultimately can only really be achieved through personal relationships. We can build flow charts and organizational theories and linkages between organizations till the cows come home, but when the balloon goes up and the fecal matter hits the fan, you're gonna need to know people, and when you pick up the phone, you're gonna need to know who to call, and you're gonna want to have a relationship with them. And this is just the reality of humanity and human endeavors. So I think this is one of the things is like we can management consultant the whole of government problem to death, but at the end of the day, if it's not predicated upon people working with people that they trust, it's not going to get to whole of government or whole of society.
And just to add that, it's also, because they just, a lot of people in the, especially emergency management realm, a lot of people don't have military experience. They just don't understand what's important to us and what's critical. And it's having somebody on the ground there that can make sure they understand what's critical and why it's critical. As much information as we can give them, of course, but why it's critical and why we need their support doing that, whatever we need to get done.
General Lawrence, myself, somewhere in the audience, asked a question here that I'm going to read. It says, whole of government has been mentioned more than a dozen times today. With the current political situation in the United States, how do you posture your command to continue to provide strategic transportation in the absence of an approved appropriations bill from Congress?
For U.S. Transcom, we don't operate primarily off a appropriated budget. So we operate off of a working capital fund. For Transcom, it's the Transportation Working Capital Fund, the TWICF. And so that gives us a little bit more room in terms of our ability to fund requirements. That being said, our customers, primarily the Army, operates off of a appropriated budget. And so it's a careful dance we have to do in terms of rate adjustments, billing rates, port handling fees, messaging it so that the Army can program accordingly for transportation costs as they execute, whether it be exercises or rotational support and support or operational requirements. Hope that answers your question. Okay.
Thank you very much. In addition to appropriating, I hear there are other people in Congress that do authorize. I was working for an appropriator, so try not to pay attention to them. But authorities are always a big question when it comes to logistics and when it comes to response. General Sherman, you mentioned some in your initial comments. Would you care to expand a little bit on some challenges related to authorities?
Well, sure. In the Homeland, your authorities that you're used to on an overseas fight, they're not there. We do follow the Constitution. It's a joint interagency task force solution within the Homeland, unless there's a presidential directive, of course, which could happen in times of war. But that again, that makes it difficult. As Andrew, that's where the whole of government does come into play, because each government agency has its, by law is set what it's allowed to do or what it is in charge of doing. And we in the military, in the Homeland, you can protect your base. You are authorized to protect your base, but anything outside that base, including the airspace, is owned by somebody else, is controlled by somebody else. And that takes interagency coordination that has to happen.
And we've especially seen that lately, a lot of discussion related to the cyber domain there. Andrew, would you mind commenting a little bit on the cyber domain? Sometimes at these panels, more cyber is the more cowbell of the panels, but there is a component there that creates new but not entirely unique problems. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So to quote a colleague who shall remain nameless, I am panel dangerous on cyber, which means I know a combination of words that I can string together that make me sound like I know something, but there's actually not a ton of expertise there. So with that caveat up front, one of the challenges with cyber in comparison to many other domains is and this has been written about by scholars of the domain before, is it behaves in this weird space between conventional military operations and intelligence operations, in that it is pervasive and all-encompassing and always there, and you always have to think about it, but you can almost sort of be lulled into a sense that it's just sort of in the background. I think when I think about the effects, less so technically how it's achieved, but more the effects of cyberspace operations on the Homeland and logistics in particular, it is always about throwing sand in the gears and slowing things down. Regardless of how that's achieved, when I think about it from a red teaming perspective, which is one half or one part of my actual job, it is a tool that is highly advantageous for doing that, especially at discrete times and places because of the access challenges associated with it, but paired with other effects. You're probably in a conflict situation not going to just see cyber by itself. It will be paired as part of a larger campaign. And I think that's where it starts to get tricky. Going back to the cognitive domain, it's how it's ultimately used to influence the will of the United States to fight. And I think that's why cyber keeps a lot of people up at night.
So I'll just add, from a DoD Joint Deployment Distribution Enterprise standpoint, I look at, and really our leadership looks at cyber security as one of the largest, if not the largest asymmetric threat to our operation, to our ability to conduct deployment and distribution operations. Because of concerns not only with the DoD, but also has been alluded to in previous panels. I think Colonel Henry talked to it. The ability of our adversaries to access the networks of our commercial partners, the majority of whom operate on unclassified networks. And so it starts with, one, having the infrastructure and the systems within your organization to respond. So Transcom has a cyber operations cell. I have a cyber cell within my G6 to maintain our visibility, not only on our networks, but on the networks of our commercial partners. It's ensuring that we're educating our commercial partners on the resources that are available to them to help bolster their posture and secure their networks, many of whom, are outside our organization, from Cybercom to JTF DoDIN to NSA, the resources that are available, getting them to self-report when they have issues so that we can provide them the assistance that they need, because that's always an issue. There's a perception that that's not an incentive to report when you have issues in terms of cybersecurity. And then having the recurring touch points where you bring all the stakeholders to the table so you can talk issues and make sure you're postured appropriately. I think one of the big things that's coming down the net is the CMMC implementation, cybersecurity maturity model, where, we're going to make a part of doing business with the DoD, getting to zero trust in terms of how we're doing. It'll be part of what we'll implement in terms of being able to do business with the DoD. So making sure we're communicating that, messaging that, and then referring our commercial partners to the resources they need, I think is critically important.
Thank you for that. We have just a few minutes left. I wanted to give everyone a chance for some last words. And I just wanted to say when I was first invited to moderate this panel, my thoughts immediately went to what threats are there to our logistics system in the Homeland. Andrew brought up a very important point in his opening statement about how the U.S. Homeland is also a strength, and it's strength like no other country in the world has, nor has any other country in history had. And so just final thoughts from each of you. And I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts on that thought in particular. Andrew, do you want to lead us off?
Sure. I think that these problems are incredibly challenging, but ultimately tractable. But the hardest thing about them is that they cut across a variety of different domains, a variety of different authorities, and a variety of different stakeholders in the way that every good, wicked problem does. I don't have any easy solutions. So it's the parts of the conversations that I was able to listen to today were heartening. But I remain concerned that we say many of these words in the same way that we say whole of government, but we don't take it to heart. And this isn't just a problem within the contested logistics space. It is my great concern about force planning in the DoD writ large. We seem to have collapsed on a few shibboleths, and there isn't necessarily the movement that I would like to see. But when I come to places like this, I do get a good degree of hope coming out of it. So thanks.
So first, I think we're starting to get there. People, the leaders, certainly within DoD and our government, realize that the homeland is vulnerable. But they've had to take they've had to leverage risk. We have, even with an $800 billion budget, you still have to leverage risk. You have to, where you're going to put your money at. And certainly the Homeland is it. I'm encouraged that DOD, certainly the Army, has looked at the Homeland Defender exercise. We're going to start small, but enlarge from 26 through 30, and what that's going to look like and what we need to work on. And also putting that scenario into the European and the Pacific Defender exercises to take a look at that, so that we can start practicing defense of the homeland, if we were to go to war, and we'd have to have a complete nation mobilization to fight. And if what the homeland was struck, how we would recover from that and continue on with the mission and win. So I'm optimistic. The leaders do know there's an issue that we've got to address. They know we're vulnerable, both, in all domains, kinetic and non-kinetic. But we're starting to look at it, especially in the later years. So I'm positive about it.
General Lawrence, take us home.
Yeah, thanks, Sherman. I'll start off by saying, one, there's an inextricable link between homeland defense, defense of critical structure, and our ability to maintain our strategic advantage in terms of our ability to project combat power. Absolutely, believe that. And I'm, like the others, encouraged by the work that's being done. A lot of work being done by NORTHCOM, by our sister subcomponent command, R-North, in terms of bringing stakeholders to the table so we can talk about these issues, conduct of tabletop exercises so we can identify friction points and together develop solutions to mitigate it. We're absolutely not wishing away these challenges. We're incorporating them into our exercise design. Just 2 weeks ago, U.S. Transcom executed Turbo Challenge, and as part of the in-check missile play, we're dealing with issues where there's power loss at a port, loss of a port. We're dealing with issues where there was loss of rail line capability, and we're working our way through how to mitigate through those challenges. And I'll just end, this is an absolutely cool time to be a logistician. And I mean that sincerely, because challenges that we are facing as loggies are not being looked at as loggy problems. They're being looked at as Army problems. Appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Thank you all for joining us.